A young woman staring at her reflection in the mirror, tracing the contours of her face, wondering why her ears seem too prominent, why her features don't quite match the woman she calls mother. For 31 years, Judy Lewis lived with a gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right about her identity. She was told she was adopted, raised in the glittering world of Hollywood royalty, surrounded by luxury and privilege. But beneath the surface of that golden existence lay one of the most explosive secrets in entertainment history. This is the story of how the daughter of two of Hollywood's biggest stars was hidden in plain sight, how a cover-up that involved studio executives, religious institutions, and even the media machine itself kept the truth buried for decades. And when Judy finally learned who she really was, the revelation would shake not just her world, but challenge everything we thought we knew about old Hollywood's carefully constructed facade. Judy Lewis didn't just discover she was adopted. She discovered she was the living, breathing evidence of a scandal so enormous that it threatened to destroy careers, reputations, and the very image of wholesomeness that Hollywood sold to America. Her mother was Loretta Young, the angel-faced actress, known for her devotion to Catholicism and her pristine public image. Her father was Gable, the king of Hollywood himself, the man who made women swoon and defined masculinity for an entire generation. But in 1935, when Judy was conceived, Gable was married to another woman, and Loretta Young's career and reputation hung in the balance. What happened next was an elaborate deception that would span decades, involving fake adoption papers, strategic disappearances, and a conspiracy of silence that reached the highest levels of the Hollywood establishment. The story begins in 1934 on the set of The Call of the Wild, a rugged adventure film shot in the frozen wilderness of Mount Baker, Washington. Loretta Young was just 21 years old, already a veteran of the silver screen with a decade of acting experience behind her. She was beautiful, talented, and fiercely ambitious. Gable, at 33, was at the peak of his powers. He had just finished filming It Happened One Night, the romantic comedy that would win him an Academy Award and cement his status as Hollywood royalty. When these two stars came together in the remote mountain location, away from the prying eyes of Los Angeles, something happened that would change all their lives forever. The production of The Call of the Wild was grueling. The cast and crew endured freezing temperatures, dangerous conditions, and the isolation of being hundreds of miles from civilization. In that intense, pressure cooker environment, Loretta Young and Gable began an affair. Young, despite her strict Catholic upbringing and her carefully maintained image of virtue, fell hard for the charismatic leading man. Gable, notorious for his countless affairs with co-stars, saw Young as another conquest. What neither of them anticipated was that their brief liaison would result in a pregnancy that would force Young to make impossible choices and live a lie for the rest of her life. When Loretta Young discovered she was pregnant in early 1935, she faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything she had built. Hollywood in the 1930s operated under the strict moral guidelines of the production code, a set of rules that govern not just what could be shown on screen, but how stars were expected to behave off-screen. An unmarried pregnancy, especially one resulting from an affair with a married man, was career suicide. Studios had ironclad morality clauses in their contracts that allowed them to terminate actors who brought scandal to the company. For a Catholic actress who had built her brand on wholesomeness and virtue, an illegitimate child would have been absolutely devastating. But Loretta Young was nothing if not resourceful, and she was not about to let this pregnancy end her career. Young's solution was as audacious as it was cruel. She disappeared from Hollywood, claiming she needed a rest and was taking an extended European vacation. In reality, she retreated to a house in Venice, California, far from the gossip mills of Beverly Hills. She hid her pregnancy under loose clothing, avoided public appearances, and waited. On November 6, 1935, Judy was born. Young didn't keep her baby. Instead, in a move that seems almost incomprehensible today, she placed her newborn daughter in an orphanage. For 19 months, baby Judy lived in various institutions and temporary homes while Loretta Young returned to Hollywood, resuming her career as if nothing had happened. The actress worked, attended parties, and maintained her pristine public image while her daughter grew up among strangers. But Young couldn't stay away forever. In 1937, when Judy was 19 months old, Loretta Young staged one of the most elaborate publicity stunts in Hollywood history. She announced that she had fallen in love with two beautiful children at an orphanage and was adopting them as an act of Christian charity. One of those children was her own biological daughter, Judy. The other was a boy named Christopher, whom Young apparently adopted to make the cover story more believable. The press ate it up. Newspapers praised Young's generosity and maternal instincts. Magazine articles gushed about the selfless actress who opened her home to orphan children. Nobody suspected the truth. Nobody questioned why one of the adopted children bore such a striking resemblance to both Loretta Young and Clark Gable. Or if they did suspect, they kept their mouths shut. That's how Hollywood worked in those days. Growing up as Loretta Young's adopted daughter should have been a fairy tale. Judy lived in a mansion in Beverly Hills, attended the best schools, and rubbed shoulders with the biggest stars in Hollywood. But from her earliest memories, something felt wrong. Judy looked at herself in the mirror and saw features that didn't match her mother's delicate beauty. Her ears were prominent, sticking out in a way that made her self-conscious. Other children teased her about them. Loretta, obsessed with appearances, took Judy to doctor after doctor, trying to find a surgical solution to fix her daughter's ears. What Young couldn't admit, what she worked desperately to hide, was that those ears were a genetic gift from Clark Gable, who had the exact same distinctive feature. Judy's childhood was marked by a strange emotional distance. Loretta Young loved her daughter, but it was a complicated, guilty love tinged with resentment and fear. Every time Young looked at Judy, she saw the evidence of her greatest secret. She saw the affair, the scandal, the lies. And so, while Young provided for Judy materially, giving her everything money could buy, she withheld the one thing Judy needed most: the truth. Judy grew up feeling like something was missing, like there was a piece of herself she couldn't access. She asked questions about her biological parents, as many adopted children do, but Young's answers were vague and unsatisfying. As Judy grew older, the questions became more persistent, and Young's evasions became more elaborate. The resemblance between Judy and Clark Gable was impossible to miss. Anyone with eyes could see that this girl bore the unmistakable stamp of the king of Hollywood. Photographers noticed it. Other actors noticed it. Even strangers on the street made comments. But Hollywood's code of silence held firm. Studio executives who knew the truth protected Loretta Young because protecting her meant protecting the studio's investment. Journalists who suspected the truth kept quiet because they valued their access to stars more than they valued the truth. Friends and colleagues who knew looked the other way, understanding that in Hollywood, some secrets were simply not discussed. And Judy, the person at the center of this web of deception, remained in the dark. Clark Gable, for his part, completely denied any involvement. He never acknowledged Judy as his daughter, never reached out to her, never provided financial support. Years later, people would speculate about whether Gable knew the truth. How could he not? The physical resemblance was undeniable. But Gable had his own reputation to protect. He was married when Judy was conceived, and acknowledging an illegitimate child would have complicated his carefully managed public image. So Gable did what many men in his position did. He pretended the child didn't exist. He went on with his life, married more times, had another son after his death with his fifth wife, and never once publicly admitted that Judy Lewis was his daughter. Judy met Clark Gable only once, when she was 15 years old. It happened at a dinner party at Loretta Young's house, an encounter that Judy would later describe as one of the most confusing experiences of her life. She was introduced to the legendary movie star, and as she shook his hand, she felt an inexplicable connection, a strange recognition that she couldn't understand. Gable looked at her intently, studying her face with an expression Judy couldn't read. They made small talk, awkward and stilted, and then Gable left. Judy was left with a feeling of profound sadness and confusion, not understanding why this brief meeting with a stranger had affected her so deeply. Years later, after she learned the truth, She would look back on that moment and realize that it was the only time in her entire life that she was in the same room with both of her biological parents. As Judy moved into adulthood, she tried to build a life for herself outside of her mother's shadow. She pursued acting, following in Loretta Young's footsteps, but she never achieved the same level of success. She appeared in television shows and stage productions, but the roles were small and the recognition limited. She married a man named Joseph Tinney in 1958, and they had a daughter together, Maria. But Judy's life was haunted by the questions she couldn't answer. Who were her biological parents? Why did she feel so disconnected from the woman who raised her? Why did she bear such a striking resemblance to Clark Gable, and why did people keep commenting on it? The truth finally came out when Judy was 31 years old, in the most devastating way possible. It wasn't Loretta Young who told her. It wasn't a gradual revelation or a tearful confession. Judy learned the truth from a stranger, from someone who assumed she already knew. The revelation shattered Judy's understanding of herself and her entire childhood. Everything she thought she knew about her identity was a lie. The woman she called mother was indeed her mother, but the adoption story was a fabrication. The absent biological mother she had imagined didn't exist. And her father, the man whose identity she had wondered about her entire life, was one of the most famous men in the world, a man who had been within her reach but had chosen to deny her existence. The emotional impact of this discovery was profound. Judy felt betrayed, angry, and lost. She had spent 3 decades living a lie, and everyone around her had been complicit in the deception. Her mother had lied to her face, over and over again. The people in her life who knew the truth, and there must have been many, had chosen to remain silent. Even the man who fathered her had looked her in the eye and pretended she was a stranger. The discovery sent Judy into a spiral of questioning and soul-searching. She sought therapy, trying to process the trauma of learning that her entire identity had been constructed on a foundation of lies. She confronted her mother, demanding answers, and Young, cornered and ashamed, finally admitted the truth. But even then, even after the truth was out, Loretta Young couldn't fully own her choices. She gave Judy some of the facts, admitting that Clark Gable was her father, but she couched the story in euphemisms and justifications. Young portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, a young woman who had made mistakes and done the best she could in an impossible situation. What Young didn't address was the cruelty of placing her infant daughter in an orphanage for 19 months. She didn't acknowledge the emotional damage caused by lying to Judy for 3 decades. She didn't apologize for prioritizing her career and reputation over her daughter's right to know her own identity. And perhaps most painful of all, Young asked Judy to continue keeping the secret. Even after the truth was out between them, Young begged her daughter not to go public, not to destroy the carefully constructed image that had defined her entire career. For years, Judy honored her mother's request. She kept the secret, telling only her husband and a few close friends. She continued to navigate Hollywood's social events, maintaining the fiction for the sake of her mother's reputation. But the burden of carrying the secret was enormous. Judy felt like she was living a double life, knowing her true identity but unable to claim it publicly. She watched as biographies and articles about Clark Gable were published, none of them mentioning her existence. She saw tributes to Loretta Young that painted her mother as a saintly figure, a devoted Catholic and loving parent, and Judy had to smile and nod, choking down the truth. The turning point came in 1994 when Judy Lewis published her memoir, Uncommon Knowledge. After years of silence, after decades of protecting other people's reputations at the expense of her own truth, Judy decided to tell her story. The book was a bombshell. It laid out the entire sordid history of her conception, birth, and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Judy wrote with remarkable restraint and lack of bitterness, but the facts spoke for themselves. Hollywood's golden age, with all its glamour and glitz, was built on lies and cover-ups. Stars like Loretta Young and Clark Gable were protected by a system that valued image over truth, and the casualties of that system were people like Judy, who had their identities stolen from them. The publication of Uncommon Knowledge sparked a media frenzy. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hear Judy's story. She appeared on television shows, gave interviews to major publications, and became the public face of Hollywood's dirty secrets. One of her most notable interviews was with Dini Petty in 1994, where Judy sat down and told her story with a calm, measured dignity that was all the more powerful for its restraint. She didn't rage or weep. She simply told the truth, and the truth was devastating enough on its own. In the interview with Dini Petty, Judy spoke about the moment she learned the truth, the confrontation with her mother, and the years of therapy that followed. She talked about how the discovery affected her marriage, which ultimately ended in divorce in 1972, though Judy remained close to her ex-husband and they co-parented their daughter. She discussed her decision to become a therapist herself, specializing in adoption issues and family therapy. The trauma of her own experience led her to help others who were struggling with identity issues, adoption, and family secrets. In a way, Judy transformed her pain into purpose, using her story to help others who were living with similar burdens. One of the most poignant aspects of Judy's story is her relationship with her mother in the years after the truth came out. Loretta Young never fully acknowledged the harm she had caused. She never gave Judy the apology and closure that her daughter desperately needed. Young continued to justify her actions, framing the cover-up as necessary given the times and the circumstances. And when Judy decided to publish her memoir, Young was reportedly furious, viewing it as a betrayal and an act of disloyalty. The relationship between mother and daughter, already complicated, became even more strained. They remained in contact, but the warmth and intimacy that might have existed was forever poisoned by the lies and the years of deception. Loretta Young died in 2000, taking many of her secrets to the grave. But in her final years, Young made one more shocking revelation that added another layer to this already complex story. In 1998, 3 years before her death, Young told a family member that her encounter with Clark Gable on the set of The Call of the Wild wasn't consensual. She used the term date rape, a concept that she said she hadn't understood at the time, but that she recognized in retrospect. This revelation, made public after Young's death, completely reframed the story. If true, it meant that Loretta Young wasn't just a young woman who had made a mistake. She was a victim of assault, and the cover-up wasn't just about protecting her career, but about surviving trauma in an era that had no language or support for sexual assault victims. This late revelation is complicated and controversial. Some people believe Young was telling the truth, that Gable took advantage of her, and that her entire life was shaped by that violation. Others question the timing of the revelation, wondering why Young waited more than 60 years to describe the encounter as assault. Some speculate that Young was trying to rewrite history in her final years, shifting blame from herself to Gable to absolve herself of the guilt she had carried for decades. The truth is probably more complex than either interpretation. It's entirely possible that Young experienced something that was coercive, that operated in a gray area between consent and assault, and that it took her decades to understand and name that experience. It's also possible that the guilt and shame of lying to her daughter for 30 years motivated Young to reframe the story in a way that cast herself as more of a victim. What we know for certain is that Judy Lewis was the one who paid the highest price for whatever happened between Loretta Young and Clark Gable. Whether it was a consensual affair or an assault, whether it was a genuine connection or a moment of weakness, the result was a child who grew up not knowing her own identity. Judy spent the first 31 years of her life living a lie, and even after the truth came out, she spent another 2 decades dealing with the fallout. The emotional and psychological damage of that kind of deception is immeasurable. Clark Gable died in 1960, never acknowledging Judy as his daughter. He passed away just months before his 5th wife gave birth to his son, John Clark Gable, the only child he ever officially acknowledged. Judy was 25 years old when her biological father died, and she attended his funeral, standing among the crowds of mourners, unable to claim her relationship to the man being buried. It was another cruel twist in a story full of them. Years later, Judy would meet her half-brother, John Clark Gable, and they would develop a relationship. John accepted Judy as a sister, giving her at least some connection to the father who had denied her existence. Judy's decision to go public with her story in 1994 was incredibly brave. She knew that telling the truth would hurt her mother, would change how people viewed Hollywood's golden age, and would make her the subject of intense media scrutiny. But she also knew that keeping the secret was slowly killing her. The burden of carrying other people's lies had taken a toll on her mental health, her relationships, and her sense of self. By publishing her memoir and doing interviews like the one with Dini Petty, Judy was reclaiming her narrative. She was saying, "This is my story, and I have the right to tell it." In a world where women, and especially daughters, were expected to protect their family's reputation at all costs, Judy's decision to prioritize her own truth was revolutionary. The media response to Judy's story was mixed. Some people praised her courage and sympathized with her experience. Others criticized her for airing family secrets and tarnishing the reputations of beloved Hollywood icons. Some accused her of seeking attention or trying to profit from her famous parents. But Judy handled the criticism with grace and dignity. She was clear about her motivations. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone or destroy anyone's legacy. She simply wanted to tell her own story, to exist in the world as herself rather than as a carefully constructed fiction. She wanted other people who were living with family secrets to know that they weren't alone, that the truth, however painful, was better than living a lie. Judy's work as a therapist gave her unique insight into the dynamics of family secrets and the trauma they cause. She understood, both intellectually and experientially, how secrets poison relationships and damage identity. She worked with adoptees struggling to understand their origins, with families navigating the revelation of long-buried truths, and with individuals trying to reconcile the image they had of their parents with the reality of who those parents actually were. In many ways, Judy's entire career was shaped by her own experience. She took the pain of her childhood and transformed it into a calling, helping others navigate the same terrain she had struggled through. The story of Judy Lewis also shines a light on the machinery of old Hollywood and how it controlled the narratives around its stars. The studio system in the 1930s and 40s had enormous power. Studios didn't just make movies, they made stars. They controlled every aspect of an actor's public image, from the roles they played to the stories that were told about them in fan magazines. When a scandal threatened that carefully constructed image, the studio's publicity machine went into overdrive, spinning stories, planting favorable articles, and ensuring that the truth never reached the public. In Loretta Young's case, MGM and the other studios she worked for helped maintain the fiction of Judy's adoption, using their influence with journalists and photographers to ensure that uncomfortable questions were never asked. This system of control extended beyond just managing scandals. Studios arranged marriages between stars to hide their homosexuality, fabricated romantic relationships to generate publicity, and created entire fictional biographies for actors whose real backgrounds didn't fit the image the studio wanted to project. The stars themselves often had little say in how they were presented to the public. They signed contracts that gave studios the right to control their appearance, their behavior, and even their personal relationships. In this context, Loretta Young's decision to hide her pregnancy and fabricate an adoption story wasn't unusual. It was simply how the system worked. The unusual part was that the lie lasted for so long, and that when the truth finally came out, it was the daughter, not the mother, who chose to reveal it. Judy's story also intersects with larger conversations about women's autonomy, reproductive rights, and the double standards that have always existed around sexuality. In 1935, an unmarried woman who became pregnant had very few options. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. Giving birth out of wedlock meant social ostracism and economic hardship. For a woman in Loretta Young's position, with a career and public image to protect, the pressure to hide the pregnancy was overwhelming. Young's solution, placing her daughter in an orphanage and then staging a fake adoption, was extreme, but it was born out of desperation. She saw no other way to reconcile her public image with the reality of her situation. At the same time, we can acknowledge the impossible situation Loretta Young found herself in while also recognizing the harm her choices caused her daughter. Both things can be true. Young was a victim of a system that punished women for their sexuality while giving men like Clark Gable a pass to behave however they wanted. And Judy was a victim of her mother's choices, forced to live a lie because of circumstances she had no control over. The tragedy is that this kind of story, where a woman's desire to protect herself ends up harming her child, plays out over and over again in families dealing with secrets and shame. As Judy Lewis became more public about her story in the 1990s, she also became an advocate for adoptee rights. She spoke about the importance of allowing adopted individuals access to their birth records and information about their biological parents. She argued that everyone has a fundamental right to know their own origins and that secrecy around adoption, while often well-intentioned, can cause deep psychological harm. Her advocacy work was informed by her own experience, but it resonated with thousands of adoptees who had similar stories of searching for identity and struggling with the gaps in their personal histories. Judy lived the last years of her life with a sense of peace and resolution that had eluded her for so long. She had told her story, reclaimed her identity, and helped others do the same. She maintained a relationship with her daughter and grandchildren, creating the kind of honest, loving family bonds that had been missing in her own childhood. She continued her work as a therapist, wrote articles about family dynamics and identity, and became a respected voice in conversations about adoption and family secrets. When she was diagnosed with cancer in 2011, she faced her illness with the same quiet strength that had characterized her entire adult life. Judy Lewis died on November 25, 2011, at the age of 76. She passed away in Gladwine, Pennsylvania, surrounded by family. The obituaries that ran in newspapers around the world identified her as the daughter of Clark Gable and Loretta Young, a title that she had been denied for the first 3 decades of her life. In death, she was finally, publicly, acknowledged as who she truly was. Her passing was noted not just because of who her parents were, but because of who she had become: a therapist, an author, an advocate, and a woman who had transformed personal trauma into a force for good. Looking back at Judy's life, what strikes me most is her resilience. She could have been destroyed by the revelation of her true parentage. She could have spent the rest of her life bitter and angry at the people who lied to her. Instead, she chose to understand her story in context, to recognize the complicated circumstances that led to her mother's choices, and to use her experience to help others. That doesn't mean she wasn't hurt or angry. Her memoir makes clear that she was both. But she didn't let those feelings define her. She worked through them, processed them in therapy, and came out the other side with a sense of purpose. The legacy of Judy Lewis extends beyond her own story. She opened up a conversation about Hollywood's treatment of women, about the costs of maintaining a perfect public image, and about the damage that family secrets inflict across generations. Her willingness to speak her truth gave permission to countless others to speak theirs. In the years since her memoir was published, more and more stories have emerged about the hidden children of Hollywood stars, the arrangements and cover-ups that were standard practice in the studio era. Judy's story was one of the first to break through the wall of silence, and it paved the way for others to follow. Today, when we watch old movies from Hollywood's golden age, it's easy to get lost in the glamour and romance of that era. We see beautiful stars in gorgeous costumes, living lives of luxury and sophistication. But Judy Lewis's story reminds us that behind the glossy facade were real people dealing with real problems. The stars we idolize were human, with all the flaws and complications that humanity entails. They made mistakes, told lies, and hurt the people they loved. And the machinery of Hollywood, designed to present perfection to the world, often ground up the truth and the people who tried to tell it. Clark Gable's legacy as the king of Hollywood remains largely intact. He's still remembered as one of the greatest actors of his generation, the definitive leading man of the studio era. The revelation that he had an illegitimate daughter whom he never acknowledged added a dark note to his story, but it didn't fundamentally change how he's remembered. Loretta Young's legacy is more complicated. The revelation about Judy, combined with the late-life allegation of assault, has led to a reassessment of Young's life and career. She's still recognized as a talented actress and a beauty icon, but the saintly image she cultivated during her life has been significantly tarnished. The story of her secret daughter has become, in many ways, the defining narrative of her life. But perhaps the most important legacy belongs to Judy herself. She took a story that was about secrets and shame and transformed it into a story about truth and healing. She refused to be defined by what was done to her, choosing instead to define herself through her actions and choices. She showed that it's possible to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it, to recognize injustice without being paralyzed by bitterness. And she reminded us all that behind every carefully constructed public image is a human story, messy and complicated and real. The interview Judy gave to Dini Petty in 1994 remains one of the most powerful pieces of television from that era. Watching it now, decades later, you can see the mix of emotions playing across Judy's face as she tells her story. There's pain there, certainly, but also strength. There's sadness, but also a kind of peace. She's not asking for pity or sympathy. She's simply telling her truth, claiming her identity, and inviting viewers to understand the human cost of Hollywood's golden age. The interview is a masterclass in dignity and grace under pressure, and it serves as a fitting testament to Judy's character. In the years since Judy's death, her story has been retold in documentaries, articles, and books about old Hollywood. Each retelling adds new details, new context, new perspectives. But at the heart of all these retellings is the same fundamental story: a daughter searching for her identity, a mother protecting her secrets, and a father who never acknowledged his child. It's a story that resonates because it's about more than just Hollywood celebrities. It's about family, truth, and the courage it takes to claim your own story when the world wants you to live someone else's lie. If Judy Lewis were here today, looking back on her life and legacy, I think she would be proud of what she accomplished. She told her truth, even when it was hard. She helped others find theirs. She transformed personal pain into professional purpose. And she lived to see her story acknowledged, her identity validated, and her courage recognized. That's not a fairy tale ending, but it's something perhaps more valuable. It's a real ending, an honest ending, an ending that Judy herself chose. And for a woman who spent the first 31 years of her life living someone else's story, being able to write her own ending was the greatest victory of all.